can't wait for a guardianship or a conservatorship hearing for somebody to have standing. And so I've had detectives go in and get the restraining orders. And in truth, I haven't had anybody fight it after the fact, but I don't know how that would play out, because it doesn't happen that often, but I'm seeing it more and more of late. So I don't even know how it would play out. Who even has the standing to be able to address that? And going back to some of the punishment and criminal aspect, the thing that I run into, and this is, we're trying to work something up in Arizona for background checks for people who provide home health care, or home care actually is the broader umbrella. In truth, and because our group in Tucson actually started this ball rolling legislatively at our AG's office, and then once it got rolling, I started actually surveying my cases. Probably 85% of my cases are first-time offenders. They are not serial offenders. I hate to admit it, but I'm excited when I get a serial offender, when I get somebody in my clutches who's done this before. But probably 85% of my criminal cases are crimes of opportunity that this is the first time they've done it. They may do it again, which is part of the reason why I always pursue them. But I'm not sure how much the background check is going to make a difference, especially with the family situations where it's son won't leave the couch, who's now taking care of mom.
And he's still not off the couch.
No background check is going to stop that.
Okay, so a couple of things I'm hearing, and I see we're running short of time. We have a couple more questions we want to spend a moment on, is sometimes the question is, do we have adequate remedies? Standing being one, restraining orders, do they reach this population? Some of your domestic violence orders are not going to fit the sorts of behaviors that we're going to see. It's also recognizing that there are holes in pretty much all of the legal systems that I'm hearing described. All right, so let me throw another question your way, and then we're going to do some wrap. So let's dream a little bit. How do we fix it? How do we make systems better? What sort of pieces do we need to be thinking about that would improve? And I know we've got some folks here who've thought about it a lot, and like to hear briefly from both of you. And then I'd like to hear from others. Go ahead. Linda?
I appreciate the gentleman raising the issue of standing. I was facing that myself for 3 years. My mom was a victim of abuse that continued for 3 years. The court determined that I did not have standing to bring elder abuse litigation to protect her until after she died. My mom died about 6 weeks ago, and my attorney is now drafting the elder abuse complaint. But if families could have standing to protect their loved ones, their parents, while the victim was still alive, it's very expensive, it's very unpleasant, but it at least would be some sort of remedy rather than watching your parent abused until she dies and then coming back for retaliation.
Okay. Go ahead.
This is Margaret Dorr, and I was just going to raise an issue that sometimes someone will be put under guardianship to protect them, and then what I've seen is that the guardian, especially maybe a company, starts abusing them, for example, by churning the case, for example, pitting one side of the family against the other, and then billing to stop the conflict that they've created, that kind of thing, or actual markers of embezzlement. And there's really no way to bring it to the court because the court is not really suited to be an oversight person. So I had suggested in Washington State that we look at having, say, the Office of Financial Responsibility or whatever it's called, that oversees like check cashing places to at least oversee the financial stuff. So there's some structural problems, and there's lots of conflicts of interest among the lawyers, and I know someone else would like to talk.
All right, I want to pass, again, I asked a couple of people to think about their remarks, so I'm going to, because she's closest to you, Lori, why don't you weigh in with your thoughts, and then we've got a couple hiding over here.
Sure, I'm Lori Stiegel again. Candy asked me to touch on civil issues, so I'll do that fairly briefly. I think y'all have totally nailed it in terms of civil remedies. You know, clearly what we have is not adequate. It's a hammer. The law is not really good at dealing with situations of dysfunctional families or many of the other challenges that we see. A concrete example is that when guardianship or conservatorship is pretty much our only viable remedy for undue influence, but yet we can't really tell if somebody has capacity or not, or may be a victim of undue influence even though they have decision-making capacity. That's a huge gap there. That's just one example. Civil remedies for victims of sexual abuse or psychological abuse are particularly problematic. It's a little easier for physical abuse or financial abuse. To maybe win a judgment, collecting the money is another challenge, though. But I want to diverge a little bit because it's, you know, you can have fantastic statutes on the books, but if you can't get legal assistance to get to court, or you can't even get to court, neither of those things do very well. So we really need to also be considering the availability of civil legal services in the U.S., whether free legal aid type services, which are completely overwhelmed and have great difficulty taking elder abuse cases, or whether it's lawyers who are paid to provide those services, who generally charge too much if anybody still has money left with which to pay them, and who often are not trained on these issues. We have huge gaps there. And then again, getting to the court, sitting in the court, making it through the court process, which is lengthy, which is slow, which is expensive for everybody, and therefore has a disparate impact on older victims, particularly those who've been victims of elder abuse, is a challenge. Having trained jury pools is certainly an important issue. Having judges who understand the problem is also a huge problem, and something that we've been working on for a number of years and continue to have a great need to work on. You know, the Department of Justice and a lot of the states have done tremendous work in improving the response of the criminal justice system, though we have a long way to go. And the civil justice system has really been left out of the picture, and it's time to really start folding them in as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Jean, you had some comments earlier. Do you want to make any additional comments? All right, Tony. Tony's ready. So Tony, if you could please. Tony has the final word. And
that's only because I'm last. It is very frustrating as a prosecutor, certainly. The criminal justice system, unfortunately, always looks backward. It does not look forward. Every other system discipline looks forward to giving remedies or help or aid to a victim. But the criminal justice system always looks back in time to prove what occurred in the past and to try and stop it. It is not very well equipped to go forward with it. We can try some of these things that are talked about, but the therapy that a victim receives is done by people kind of outside the criminal justice system. And how we want to change the criminal justice system and the civil justice system, it's certainly something that should be looked at, and we can certainly talk about it. But again, that is going to be a difficult road to pull defense lawyers, defense legislatures, and to pull judges to go forward and see how we're going to do this in the criminal justice system, provide the remedies, I think, that are probably necessary for victims in these kinds of cases.
all right, thank you. To one and all, thank you. Clearly, we would love to keep talking for another several hours, and there's lots more we'd all like to say and think. If something comes to mind that you didn't get a chance to express, remember you have papers in your materials that give you a chance to add comments, to add ideas. The fact that it's on paper instead of being said verbally does not mean it won't make its way into the training, so nothing is being wasted. So if there are things you would have liked to say but couldn't, please write them down, because we do take a very careful look at everything. Thank you so much. We have a short break, and when we return at 3:15, we will be in whatever your next session is, so follow your colors. And we'll see the folks in yellow, I believe, next at 3:15. Enjoy your break.
In the afternoon. Welcome. We are going to talk about basically trauma treatment and some of the folks who are responsible for hopefully treating victims and assisting victims, and specifically we are addressing healthcare practitioners, mental health care practitioners, DV and sexual assault. But many of you were put in this group even though you don't work in those fields, because we want your input on what do you need from those professionals in terms of assisting victims. So we're going to go really, really quickly around the room. We want everybody to tell us your name and where you work and what you do.
Bruce Angus, I work in adult protection in New Hampshire. Chuck Ordance, prosecutor for the Minnesota Attorney General's office. We do financial exploitation of vulnerable adult cases.
Mary Toomey, University of California at Irvine. I work in the National Center on Elder Abuse and other places. Deb Fogarty, Executive Office of Elder Affairs in Massachusetts. I'm the Director of
Amy Sweezy, head of the County Attorney's Office in Minneapolis. I prosecute violent crime against elders and vulnerable adults.
Lisa O'Neill with the University of Arizona Center on Aging.
Lori Smetanka, Director of the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center at the Consumer Voice.
Diane Menio, and I'm with the Center for Advocacy for the Rights and Interests of the Elderly, CARI, in Philadelphia. And I'll just mention that
They obviously didn't get the memo to pass the mic around, so nothing I can do there.
Great.
Mary Lynn Cassidy, Area Agency on Aging in Phoenix.
Jason Burnett, University of Texas Medical School, assistant professor there, and also associate director of clinical and behavioral research for the Texas Elder Abuse Treatment Institute.
Katie Galinas from Greta Lynn Senior Services in Massachusetts, where I run a specialized program for older victims of domestic violence.
Barbara Kidder, Director of Adult Protective Services in Oklahoma.
Wendy Lustpeter, and I teach trauma and recovery at the School of Social Work in Seattle.
Tricia Annesberger, I'm an educator and consultant from Ohio.
Kevin Bigelow, retired APS worker and supervisor, now a trainer and consultant on adult services issues.
Great.
Linda Kincaid, elder advocate from California.
Margaret Dorr, and president of Choices and Illusion. I'm an attorney and president of Choices and Illusion, which is a nonprofit corporation opposed to euthanasia-assisted suicide, which can be a legal form of elder abuse.
Jennifer Kirchen, Minnesota Adult Protective Services.
Carrie Embry, Social Services Manager for the Elder Protective Services for the state of Nevada.
Great.
Nikki Irish, I'm from Chicago, and I'm an elder abuse and self-neglect researcher.
Marta Fontaine, Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services. We are the APS agency in our state.
Alice Hayes, Illinois Department on Aging, Adult Protective Services. Lois Mormon, Illinois Department on Aging.
Sharon Marinina, University of Delaware.
I'm the clearinghouse of abuse and neglect of the elderly.
Erin Miller, I'm part of a healthcare day sexual and domestic violence program, and I'm with the project management team for the National Sane Health System.
Julie Boyle, University of Toledo, and on staff at 3 hospitals.
Ron Dolan, social work professor.
Paul Needham, Adult Protective Services in Oklahoma.
Hi, Susan Aces. I'm working on a project with the Area Agency on Aging, Palm Beach and Treasure Coast in Florida.
Hi, I'm Joy Ernst. I'm professor of social work at the College of Frederick, Maryland.
Isabel Markley, I'm a member of the International Association of Forensic Nurses. I do sexual assault exams and wellness consults in a retirement community.
Great.
Melissa Biederman, Deputy Attorney General for the California Attorney General's Office, and I prosecute elder abuse.
Great. Okay. Pat?
Pat Brownell, and I'm an emeritus professor of social work at Fordham University in New York City.
Great. Kathleen? Yeah, just probably most people know you, but
Karen Roberta, Karen Roberta, Virginia Tech.
all right, and you met Holly Ramsey Klosnick from Boston, yes, and
Dan Sheridan from Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing.
great, thank you all. All right, we're going to turn the slide, and we thought that it made sense to start this session by putting up a definition of trauma-informed care, because I think and I hope we could all agree that what we would ideally like from healthcare, mental health, DV, sexual assault, as well as other service practitioners and providers would be trauma-informed care, so that as we've been discussing throughout the day, the trauma the individual has been exposed to could be considered in treatment plans. And so there's a number of different definitions. Erin provided this definition for us, and I liked it, so we're going to go with this one. Basically, trauma-informed care, a strengths-based framework grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma, emphasizing the physical, the psychological, and the emotional safety of the victim. And I think that probably for all services, that's a good place to come from, whether it's APS or it's sexual assault or it's DV or it's mental health or it's healthcare. And not just the safety, obviously the safety of the victim, the survivor, but also the safety of the provider. And I think we're talking both physical safety, but psychological safety as well because of secondary trauma and vicarious traumatization, and creating opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So just kind of offering that definition as a backdrop for where we might like to go and how we might like to use, ideally as we move forward, in this project of polyvictimization, and how do services need to evolve, to grow, to be better, to be more effective for victims.
I should give credit where credit is due. That is not my definition. It comes from the Trauma Center in Brookline, Mass., which is a leader in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So I'm good at plagiarizing, not at creating definitions of trauma that don't here.
Thank you, Erin. Okay. All right, we're going to also move forward. We have 2 questions to address in this brief hour. I'm going to kind of like read both questions, then we'll break it into the different fields. One question that we ask you to focus your attention on is, how can a polyvictimization perspective best be applied in healthcare, mental health, DV, and sexual assault centers to facilitate healing and recovery of victims? That's question number 1. And question number 2, how might practice in these various settings differ if a polyvictimization perspective were to be utilized? So we'll back up to question 1. Dan, as our healthcare representative, is kind of address that for a moment. Okay?
And I kind of touched on that a little bit this morning when my brief presentation this morning. But I think what I'd like to do at this point is I want to invite Isabel up. And Isabel is one of the frontline forensic nurses that we have all over this country. And I want her to talk just for a few minutes from her perspective and share a little bit about the Forensic Nursing Association.
Good afternoon. I'm awfully pleased to be here. Forensic nurses, many people think we just do sexual assault. But our training in documentation, evidence collection, and the fact that we work with law enforcement in cases going forward helps us to provide that information that you need. The International Association of Forensic Nurses provides training and opportunity for us to continue to do this. One of the things that they have done that is available is they have partnered with the OVC, and they have a curriculum for working with elder mistreatment, and it's an educational curriculum that's available on the IAFN website. So that's something you might want to look into and use in your training as well. As to how polyvictimization is going to impact me, it already is when I'm doing my sexual assault work, because my job allows me one-on-one to take the time it needs to listen to those stories and find out what else is going on. I don't have 15 minutes and 10 patients to take care of in the emergency room. I have anywhere from 4 to 8 hours to complete my exam. My problem is, what do I do with that information? Because I personally cannot follow up on it, or I'm considered biased when it comes to testifying in court. And so I'm looking for where else I can pass this on so that my patient doesn't fall through the cracks and I see them back again.
Thank you, Isabel.
Why don't we go to the next one? And we can talk. I'm going to say we'll go on to the next topic. We're going to have an opportunity to talk more about the health care. And I'm talking, when I say health, I'm talking more of the more traditional health care, physician, nurse, healthcare settings, clinics, not necessarily the mental health areas. But we'll have time to talk about that during the discussion. So we can go on to the next session. That would be good. And who's good at? Okay.
Just for a moment, I'd like to think about domestic violence or intimate partner violence in late life. It's sort of the gray area. So those individuals working in DV, and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, which is a good thing. It's good to have that kind of feedback there. But sometimes the older woman gets kind of dropped. Why is that? Well, it's policies, it's focus, it's dollars. We go over to the elder abuse side, and we pick up individuals 60 plus or whatever age group might be within your particular agency, but then they get kind of swarmed into this whole kind of idea of domestic violence being family and so forth. We don't look particularly at what happens in intimate relationships. And there's multiple pathways that older adults, and it's primarily older women, at least that's what we believe from the data that is available, that find themselves as victims of violence. They may be individuals that have had one long-term relationship that has been violent throughout. They may be a person that's in successive violent relationships throughout their lifespan. It may be a new relationship in late life that is violent, or it could be an old relationship in late life that turns violent. So there's a whole complexity of sort of their pathway, perhaps into the officer services that you all provide. If we couch that as sort of the context for polyvictimization, what do we do with it? How do we go with that? Where does it fit within this realm? Well, we're lucky to have with us today Erin Miller, who's going to speak just a little bit from her perspective and her work around domestic violence and sexual assault.
I am hopeful of sharing with you guys what I think folks in my role can bring. And I'm grateful to Holly and also to Deb Fogarty, because in Massachusetts, we're working towards building a new model where our APS folks and our faith-based folks and our domestic and sexual violence folks and our DA's offices and our police officers are all on the same page. Now, I won't tell you that happens all the time. I will tell you we're working towards it. So I hope that my sexual and domestic violence counterparts, whether they're healthcare-based or community-based, know already that they do pieces of this work. Admittedly, we don't do it well. We're getting there. We, as the collaborative community response has improved, are called on less and less. It sounds very similar to what all of you are experiencing, less and less to respond to single event trauma, and more to respond to survivors of multiple trauma, to survivors of chronic abuse, to survivors who face systems barriers. And in all of these ways, we are well equipped to help with survivors of elder polyvictimization. And at our best, we do anti-oppression work. And there are a few forms of oppression that are as potent and as unexamined as ageism, and particularly ageism and sexism, that intersection. Mm-hmm. And given our discussion this morning about needing to examine perpetrator behaviors, I will tell you what I see in a healthcare-based setting as a practice person of perpetrator behaviors. And a lot of this comes from research that we know at other points in the lifespan. We know that abusive people target folks who already have a trauma history. And the reality is, if you live into elderhood, you are statistically more likely to have a trauma history. That may have been a history of childhood sexual abuse. It may be that you are now being abused by an intimate partner, or you were in past, or maybe your child died in a car accident. Whatever it is, you are more likely, if you are 70, 80, or 90, or beyond, to have a trauma history. And abusive people look to exploit that. The other thing that I frequently see, and again, this is borne out by the research regarding other points in the lifespan, is that abusive people target folks with creative coping mechanisms, substance use, eating disorders, gambling, dissociative coping mechanisms. We judge folks who use those survival skills, those coping strategies. We pathologize them. And that's disturbing and alarming. What's even worse is when elders use those coping strategies, we invisibilize them. It's almost like it's cute. He's 90, let him have another drink. What harm could it do? We would not take that approach with someone who is 35. It is disturbing how much we minimize the health, safety, and well-being of someone who is older when it comes to substance and behavioral addictions. The third thing that we see in me and folks in my role is, and this may be the piece that we can share with all of you. I don't know, you'll have to tell me. But we have done enormous work with historical trauma. Predatory and abusive people target folks from historically marginalized communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, particularly undocumented communities, LGBT communities, financially oppressed communities, communities of people with disabilities. And we may want to pay attention to those last two in particular, given the rates of poverty and disability amongst elders, particularly amongst older women. Predatory people target folks who are from historically marginalized communities. Those communities can be sources of enormous strength and resilience, and yet the messages that we send about those communities are often a problem. So we need to both recognize that people are going to carry individual and collective trauma in their body, and we need to keep doing the macro social change work. And domestic and sexual violence advocates have done a lot of work in this regard, and this may be a place where we can join the dialogue with all of you. So I would welcome the chance, my colleagues and I, to join the dialogue, and we would be happy to lend whatever expertise we have.
Great, thank you. Give that to Karen. Okay, shall we open it up for the group? What we would like to do now is, thank you so much, Karen and Isabel, for those great statements. Many of you are from other fields, but some of you are from healthcare. We don't have enough mental health clinicians, as I was just, talking about in the other session, but we have at least somebody else in the room. And we have some great sexual assault DV people. Can we turn our attention to answering this first question? How can a polyvictimization perspective best be applied in these centers? And for those of you who don't work in these fields, who work in another field, a parallel field such as APS, what do you want from healthcare, mental health, sexual assault, and DV folks to help you do your job better?
And I'm going to go ahead and we'll start with the healthcare. Who here, by show of hands, is a medical or nursing practitioner of some type? So we have one couple here. Okay, let's talk about healthcare. Not just to the people who are medical, but let's touch on that. What are some of your ideas? And we're going to be recording them both on a flip chart. We're also typing them up. What are some of your thoughts? And as you raise your hand, I'll be passing the microphone to you, which means you're going to be on camera. I just want to give you that heads up. When you get the microphone in your hand, just give your name. Just, Mary Jones, and then just go ahead and give me your question or your comment. So let's talk about healthcare. Who's going to be the first brave soul? Okay, here we go.
Julie Coyle from Toledo, Ohio, University of Toledo, and Mercy System Hospitals. Two things that are bothering me as a practitioner when I walk in the door. And the public and our other partners in care don't know these changes happen. The observation admission is the new nightmare for healthcare, and it is going to be the new APS nightmare. I already see you know. When you are only admitted as an observation status, then your 3 midnights sleeping in the hospital don't occur. So it means you get to take no advantage of your Medicare benefits for long-term care. So even though we don't want to always institutionalize somebody when somebody can't walk or has a broken hip, we want that. And the shift to Medicaid is that's going to be your only option. How do you prove somebody's broke enough when you can't even find all the bank records? And that takes time. So we're going to have a nightmare because of the observation, unless on the national level we can fight and say, but when it's elder abuse, is there a track that we can do? The other thing is competitive bidding that started July 1st, which I am really cranky about. In our area, in Toledo, Ohio, we have no vendors approved to be a vendor for walkers. Simple thing, right? $150 for a rolling walker with 5-inch wheels that the therapists always recommend. And the reason we do is because competitive bidding, while a good idea, when thought through, gee, we could pay 1/6 the price for our medications if Medicare could competitively bid, like Spain, Germany, England, all those other countries do. The bad news is they didn't think about what was going to happen with all these other things. So we have one vendor an hour away with the permission to be the vendor for Medicare patients, and it's a Walmart in Port Clinton. So not a durable medical equipment company, no expertise whatsoever. And so if we amputate someone's leg, they have to hop an hour to this vendor to maybe get it. And the way they underbid everybody was they put no delivery charge in their bid. So of course, old people can't drive an hour each way to get the walker. So we're asking our hospital chain to just fill up a bus worth of walkers, buy them, or do whatever we have to do to bring them. So those are some of our nightmares.
Other comments with healthcare? Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Mary Toomey, and the program that we have sits in the School of Medicine and the program in geriatrics and gerontology. And I was thinking from a healthcare setting perspective that we train all of the medical students on elder abuse, but what we don't train them currently is to recognize that if they see any form of abuse, they need to ask about multiple forms of abuse. They should be, we're happy when they can detect any part of it, and I think we need to go further than that. So I think that's one of the things we can take home and start doing right away.
What we're going to do is we're going to take 2 more comments on healthcare, then we're going to move on to the next topic.
Thank you. I'm Amy Sweezy, and I'm a prosecutor. My request for folks in healthcare would be to document. We see reports, Jerry had an unwitnessed fall, and they suspect maybe the caregiver. There are also concerns about power of attorney, period. Okay, what are those? Ask, follow up, and write down. That would be, if I could ask one thing, that's not true for our friends in forensic nursing. We get nice long reports. I understand the amount of time, but write it down. That's for us what's missing the most.
Anybody who's heard me train, I always wear ties that have musical notes on them anytime I'm doing a training that has anything to do with an abuse issue. And I wear ties with notes to remind me, to remind you, and nurses and doctors and everybody else, don't we write notes? And what we put in our nursing notes, progress notes, narrative notes has tremendous forensic implications. And we're usually more in trouble for what we don't write than what we do write.
You know, in thinking about this issue of polyvictimization, I think we can take it quite far. And I'm an advocate, and we respond to consumer complaints and problems. And it occurs to me that the same people that we get the calls from who have been discharged from the nursing home before they should have been and end up falling at home and being harmed were discharged because, number one, they didn't know their rights. They may not have spoken up about to even ask, to say, gee, I can't go home to that house with steps or whatever it is. They become victims again and again and again. They become victims not only by family members and people paid to give their care, but also by the system that kind of sets them up in that way. I mean, we have this issue with guardianship as well. To me, that is taking a victim and making them a victim all over again. And I think that happens in all of these settings. And the other thing I will say, and you know, I think the observation status is sort of this. It's part of not wanting to look deep into these people's problems. And I see that in hospitals in particular, where sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions because you might get the answers you don't want to hear.
You don't know what to do with the yes answer. Holly,
Okay.
we're going to move on to some of the other topics, and I'm going to pass
Because we did want to address mental health, let me just say a word or two about that. Some of you who were in the group that I was in a minute ago, you already heard me say a few words about mental health, but generally speaking, the mental health community, mental health practitioners, and there's a lot of different licenses that one might have to be a licensed mental health clinician, from psychiatrist, psychiatric nurse, psychologist, marriage and family therapist, counselor. Generally, the mental health folks have not gotten involved, first of all, in geriatrics. First, forget elder abuse, forget polyvic, okay? We need the mental health community. The mental health community has been very, very much involved in child abuse, because I used to be a mental health clinician working in child abuse way back in the 70s. Okay, we have lots of mental health clinicians who are interested in child abuse, and we have lots of child trauma teams, and we have lots of information about how to do therapy with polyvictimized children. So, is anybody besides Wendy and I here a licensed mental health clinician, someone who does mental health work? Okay, great. Katie, can we just open it up for a comment or two from some mental health representatives about what can we do in terms of bringing a polyvic perspective to mental health work with older victims?
Well, being, with the Area Agency on Aging in Phoenix, we had so much trouble getting mental health to really serve our clients. And so what our agency did was become licensed behavioral health agency. But also at the same time, as you were saying, Holly, we had openings almost for 6 months. We finally have filled those positions, but people don't want to work in this field. And one of the other really critical issues in mental health is that you need to go to the clients' homes. They're not going to drive to a clinic. They don't have a way to get there. They don't drive anymore, whatever. And so we are working very closely with Adult Protective Services on their cases, doing those mental health, especially hoarding issues and those types of things. But it is a rough road. We also do it with our domestic violence clients. We give them mental health counseling also.
So you brought mental health clinicians on staff?
Yes, because
Good.
we couldn't get them referred.
Good. That's great.
Hi, Katie Galinas. I think that one of the big pluses I've seen is the medical community and the behavioral health community beginning to work together. When an elder goes to a doctor's office and they have a social worker at the doctor's office that will actually take the time to ask all those questions that an elder really wants to disclose, and then have that doctor's office be able to refer to the proper agencies. And they're building relationships so that they know the clinicians that they can refer their patients to.
So there's very big issues about training for the future, which I think we should mention here because it's part of having a big impact. So, for example, at my school, when we used to say this class is about aging and elders, we would get less than 5 people signing up. So I changed the curriculum where I'm teaching trauma and recovery through the lifespan, and now it's oversubscribed. And people fight to get into the class, but elder content, they don't even know it's hitting them, is suffused throughout the class. And my graduates have told me they couldn't get a job in anything else when they graduated, but they could get a job working with elders. And I have been getting phone calls saying, thank God there was elder content. Now, I think what we all have to do in our own communities is you'll find mental health counselors who actually would be willing to serve elders, but they don't have the experience or the training. And I think on a local level, you could have a little forum for mental health practitioners of all the different stripes. It could be social worker, it could be, I like the nurses with mental health training, but they might not have had elder training. And you could have a little symposium there taught by the one person in your community that does that work, and it's amazing. People want the work, you see, but they might not, they might feel a little shy. We need to sort of grow this workforce so that when APS needs help or an elder needs help, there's somebody to call on.
We're actually going to move it and talk a little bit about the DV overlap here too.
Hey, how many of you work with older individuals that have experienced violence in intimate relationships? Okay, so what's your thoughts about that in terms of this polyvictimization sentiment that we're trying to define and get our hands on today? How do we address domestic violence or intimate partner violence within this context? What do you see as the issues? What do we need to be concerned about? I know, I'm looking for my...
Well, I think the older victim of domestic violence is the perfect example of polyvictimization. I mean, they started when they were 16, 18 years old. They've been sexually assaulted, physically abused, emotionally abused, probably financially restricted. We have a late life domestic violence program that includes emergency housing and transitional housing, and these women come with all of those, including mental health, PTSD, the whole gamut. And so we can't serve the older victims without partnering with all of the community. They haven't had the health, the mental health, they haven't had so much over the years. And I think it's a perfect example of poly-victimization over a lifetime.
Thank you. Over here. And I think that just goes to really reinforce sort of that need for the networks to come together.
Paul Needham from Oklahoma. I keep coming back to two things that I heard Holly say this morning, what Dan said this morning, got my attention. Holly, when you talked about re-victimization, the same thing, and how damaging that can be. And Dan, you talked about in the doctor world, in the medical world, about the greet and treat. It really comes down to we've got to do a better job of identifying, with the victim's help, the impact of what is happening to them over a lifespan in many cases. Sometimes the domestic violence has been 54 years, the day they got married to the day that they finally revealed, if they ever do. Many of them do not. And then sometimes it's new onset. And we've got to, the impact can be great either way. And we've got to be able to identify better and treat better.
And then, before we wrap up, we'll just get a couple comments from sexual assault.
Okay, I saw a hand over here. This is where I went ahead, so.
Should we turn to question 2?
So I was thinking in terms of polyvictimization of the older person who now is in a domestic violence situation. And there's some work out of the University of New Hampshire, Renee Bergeron, who looks at whether Adult Protective Services is actually equipped with clients who have been, she doesn't use the word polyvictimization, but to determine whether that client actually has the ability to self-determination, not related at all to capacity, not related at all to cognitive ability, but the wearing over and over and over of being victimized. And so I just want to throw that out there as sort of an issue, because the normal perspective of the client has the right to self-direct is how do we accurately identify what strengths and what, I don't want to call them weaknesses, what challenges would be inherent in a victim who had been 54 years of abuse, when at that time we're then asking, anyway, you guys know what I'm saying.
Yes.
It's just a kind of trying to be provocative.
Okay.
You may.
So
And then
Renee
we're gonna
Bergeron,
switch-
is that how you say her
Then
name?
we'll switch to some
Bergeron?
sexual assault comments.
Well, Renee Bergeron, you should look her up if anyone can spell it, Bergeron, something like that. Yeah. So she has a case study that she presents. It's in the literature, so you could Google it. Is this particular case, well, she tells the story of a woman whose husband had been really abusive and remained abusive out of his wheelchair, and he was even abusing the grandson who was in their house. And then she was blamed for abusing her husband when she set some protective limits, so he stopped ramming her with his wheelchair. And she was the one called the perpetrator. And it's a brilliant article that really raises the awareness. I think she just says it depends on your framework. Was that a domestic violence victim doing some healthy self-protection? But the APS construct saw her as the perpetrator because it's the one in the wheelchair that has to be the victim. And I think it's a very important article that we could all meditate upon the issues. Right. They're excellent.
We're going to have to stop this meeting in a few minutes, but I would be really remiss if I didn't direct our attention to the sexual assault prevention and intervention community, because we do want to address that. We do have some representatives from the sexual assault anti-violence movement, and we've had Aaron talk, but can we just have a couple comments? We've got Carla and we've got Benji here from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Can you share with us a couple of thoughts about how the polyvic perspective would be helpful, and also just about how can the sexual assault anti-violence community get more involved and be more helpful to older victims, because we need to go somewhere there. We need some improvement, right?
Sure, this is Benji Douglas, and I guess the first thing I would say is, and it's been mentioned before, is that the traditional center model of somebody calling into the receive services and they're coming in and receiving counseling or advocacy needs to be somewhat expanded, to where advocates are planning on going out talking at care facilities, talking at community centers and senior centers, and really giving an opportunity to both discuss what sexual violence in later life actually looks like, but then also to talk about how victimization is going to be different too, and so there's going to be different needs. The other thing we talk a lot about with centers is if you're going to advertise more or less that you actually have services that are available, you need to actually make sure that services are available. That means that there are people there who are comfortable both working with older adult survivors, but there's materials that reflect actually older adult survivorship, and that there is an ease of comfort with it, because you don't want to tell somebody over and over again, oh, you're our first older adult client, or we haven't worked with somebody like you before. And those kind of things come up because people feel excited, but that excitement shouldn't be limiting.
I would say the one practice I've seen really work well with elder victims, first, we know that it takes time to build that rapport. Sexual violence is very difficult to talk about, and we know that folks in later life, it takes even longer to get to the point where really healing starts to begin in terms of counseling. And the one thing we've really seen do well at programs is a group setting. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be all older adults in a group setting. It can be mixed ages. But we've really seen this process work well, and it also helps with, in terms of time that advocates have in this lovely economy. So that's just one thing I'd like to share.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I'm a nationally certified sexual assault nurse examiner, and I've lost the number of hundreds of exams that I've done. I can't track them anymore. But if we're going to start saying that we have sexual assault in later life, we have to admit and be comfortable with the fact that elderly do have consensual sexual relationships. And we have this myth that once you hit a certain age, you're no longer sexually active. So if we're going to really begin to say sexual assault is occurring, we've got to get comfortable saying consensual sex is occurring too. And we're not comfortable talking to elderly people about that.
In our area, which is rural Southwest Virginia, one of the things that our Women's Resource Center has done is to, in their volunteer program, to do a senior-to-senior time frame in their hotlines or in their support telephone trees. So it sounds simple. It took some work to get that together, but it was a way to let the community know that there's someone here who might be like you, meaning like this older person, and that's been very successful in its relatively short time of getting more individuals to call and start asking questions, and then certainly get referred to the most appropriate person. But it was a big step for them, and it seems to be working.
And I think that another suggestion there is to have older people on your staff. If you are running a mental health services, a service for seniors, or a DV service for seniors, or a sexual assault center where you're welcoming older victims, can we at least not have every staff member and volunteer be under the age of 30? Because then the client doesn't feel comfortable. We have to close up in a few minutes, but can we just open it to the entire group? How might practice across these 4 settings of trying to respond to the trauma of victims, how would it be different if a true polyvic perspective was employed?
Hi, I'm Kevin Bigelow, and we're trying to think of the best way to say this. If indeed we're going to approach a polyvictimization perspective, then I think we're going to acknowledge that polyvictimization is a complex sort of a situation that's going to need assistance from a variety of different services and organizations. And if we do that, one of the areas that I think needs improvement, and as I look back, I was guilty of this myself. I jumped around working a lot of different organizations and agencies, and very often we did not know exactly what the other organizations offered or did. And I can think of, I started out working med-psych, inpatient psych units attached to hospitals. As we described services to people as they were discharged, oh, you're going to go to the mental health clinic, you'll have a therapist for years, and they'll spend lots of time, maybe you'll have a psychoanalyst or whatever. And of course, that wasn't available. So they got out, and none of that was available. Working in the psych ER, we talked about, oh yeah, we're going to release you, but you're going to go to the clinic and you'll get this and that and whatnot. And of course, that wasn't available. And then, social services, same sort of thing. I would hear my workers when I was a supervisor, trying to tell the hospital, well, it's not safe for him to go home, so you just have to keep him in the hospital until we find something better. maybe a few weeks or a month. You don't mind, do you? And that wasn't realistic. So I think if we're going to approach polyvictimization, we're going to define it, we're going to look at working together. We may not always agree because we have different perspectives, but we need to try to learn more from one another about what services are actually available. Otherwise, people go right out there and fall right in the crack because we don't know.
So then we all need to be a team.
Right, agreed.
Other comments?
All right. We have to wrap this up because we're scheduled. No, we go to 4:15. Excuse me. We don't have to wrap this up. Oh my God, we've been so time pressured all day. All right, we have 15 more minutes for discussion. Great.
Oh, you said you wanted another comment. One thing I've noticed myself, I just went from a solo practitioner doctor to the University of Washington that has the electronic records. I am no longer as frank with my doctor because, well, I know some people that are doctors that have access to that information that I don't necessarily want them to. And my name is a little distinctive. And so there's this counter thing. Part of the theme today is to get people to talk about everything that's gone on. Well, you've just then put in some official record all these markers to put you under guardianship or something. So, I mean, I'm a guardianship lawyer, so I fought guardianship, so that's how I see it.
Margaret, I think that's an extremely important point that we have been talking about, trying to look at the whole gamut of victimization that any individual client or patient has been exposed to. But I also want to join with you in issuing a caution around it really must be up to that individual to choose to reveal any aspect of their victimization history or to choose not to reveal. And there's many considerations, including the electronic records, but also just the whole privacy issue, the whole, who do you want to know about really embarrassing stuff that happened to you that if the victim is not ready to discuss and disclose, and we really have to move to, yes, let's understand the polyvictimization history, but let's respect the survivor's right to keep private stuff private and to have the right to choose where they're going to discuss it and with whom they're going to discuss it, or not to discuss it at all, because we know that in mental health services, one of the cardinal rules is don't tamper with the defenses. And if someone was in fact raped at age 7 and has that all really put away so they can function well in the world, the worst thing you can do as a mental health clinician is say, tell me about that, and open that door when that may not be the best way to survival for this victim. So that's a good point you're raising.
Isabel Markley. This is something that we as forensic nurses are struggling with in sexual assault and DVD, because up until the electronic health records, many of our records, especially our forensic records, were sealed, and they were not accessible except by subpoena or by the person requesting them themselves, including any photographs or body maps that we did. Now with electronic records in some hospitals, those are not sealed anymore. They're scanned into the general medical record. And so here we are trying to get a really good background on how this happened and what happened, and yet at the same time, we're possibly exposing that information where it shouldn't be accessible.
I just want to throw in also rural areas. It becomes a big issue because they don't have many options for physicians and health providers. And so the disclosure when it's face-to-face and nothing going on is difficult. Now with the worry that everybody will see that, it becomes even more a worry for individuals.
I would like to follow up on the issues related to guardianship. And in the guardianship cases where I've advocated for victims of guardians, we've found universally that the healthcare providers absolutely take the word of the guardian for their version of abuse, well, for their version of how symptoms occurred, and they just don't look any deeper. They don't look for possible various forms of abuse. Polyvictimization would not even be on their radar because they do not see abuse at all, because there's an assumption that the guardianship is overseen by the court and well managed, and that is rarely the case.
Okay. For those of you who don't work in these 4 fields we're addressing, health, mental health, sexual assault, DV, because I know we have a lot of APS people here, what do you need from the practitioners in those 4 fields to help you do a better job with your clients?
Barbara Kidder. we need them to listen to us. APS workers can provide a wealth of what might seem like trivial information, but if an informed provider in another field really listens and asks questions and helps us put it together to tell our client's story, I think that would go a long way toward helping us.
Lori Smetanka. I think in addition to listening to the APS workers and the ombudsman, who I work primarily with, I think being a resource for those networks and being available for training opportunities and providing information to them, I think would be tremendously helpful.
I just want to build on the comment we talked about a few minutes earlier about electronic medical records. They're here to stay. They're not going to go away. There are tremendous pressures coming from the CMS level, the payment level, the insurance companies, that not only do we have electronic medical records, but we also have what's called medical homes, where basically you're going to have maybe a primary provider or group, but those records are going to be there. Now, I'm sort of yes in favor of it because we can certainly track the 5 different fall off the ladder, age 90 type cases that will come in, but also there are issues around confidentiality. We have HIPAA, which is sometimes enforced, sometimes not. But what I've also seen in medical records is that the people who design them aren't really nurses and doctors. They're more like computer guys and gals, and they're check boxes. And in a lot of medical records, you just check boxes. And I've lost the patient. When I read the medical records, I don't know how the patient's actually doing. I know their vital signs, I have all these check marks, but we're not getting sort of that good narrative descriptions that we need to provide the poly services that we need or that prosecutors might need, because it's all check boxes. And so they're here to stay, but I think they're at their infancy, and I think all of us can inform the medical records systems in our communities on how to make sure that those records are helpful, but also are confidential.
So Erin had mentioned that, Massachusetts is really working to form, more collaborations with the sexual assault and domestic violence communities. And that's fine, and we have trainings and cross-trainings, and we're talking to one another, but the services still really aren't accessible to our APS clients. And that would really, and people have mentioned it here before, but, we need mental health practitioners to do home visits. We need sexual assault and domestic violence advocates to meet our victims, in other places other than their office. So.
That is such a critical need, because so often I'll consult on a case of an older person who has trauma history. They've been a victim of sexual assault recently. They're perhaps currently a victim of domestic violence. They could really benefit from supportive psychotherapy. They use a wheelchair, and they are not going to leave their second-floor apartment without maybe even EMTs coming and taking them by ambulance. And so the APS worker wants to suggest, well, maybe some sexual assault counseling from the sexual assault center. But of course, oftentimes the sexual assault center doesn't want to get the referral from the APS worker. They want that client to call personally, which I understand, the empowerment model. But we have people in APS who can't use the phone because they have aphasia, or they have paralysis after a stroke, or they have the wheelchair. They can't go to the DV center. They can't go to the sexual assault center. They can't go to the mental health clinician. How are we going to get essential services to those people?
One thing I did want to mention directly to speak to that comment, Holly, is that, sorry, Carla, is that every state has a assistive technology library that offers assistive technology for rental for a short period of time for free. And if a person receives any kind of disability funding, that can include the purchase of that technology. And so ours in Pennsylvania is called PIOP, the Pennsylvania assistive technology library, and every state has one. It's usually connected to centers of excellence around disability at the university level. But just to put that out there, I think we need to start being creative with our service provision and technology. There are certainly issues around confidentiality that come into play, but signing waivers and coming up with creative solutions, I think could work in this case.
I just want to kind of tail on what you were just saying there, and that is that we are seeing more telemedicine kind of interventions and online support groups and things like that. And of course, we do have to think about the privacy issues, as you said, but they're out there, and the fastest growing consumer group using technology on the internet are older individuals. And I do also want to think about one other concept here, and that is that if we are talking about people going into the homes, professionals, mental health professionals, and other service providers, there also is the component of safety for the healthcare providers as well. And we do have to consider that as part of it, because folks who have been in the social service world have been grappling with that for a long time, and you already know you're going into a scenario that's volatile at best. And I have one other thought about the mental health aspects, and that is that I think we don't want to ignore the potential for mental health services to be useful in working with abusers or would-be abusers in those appropriate scenarios, because we know that most cases are not going to be meeting the threshold of prosecution or anything like that. We know that most victims are not necessarily wanting to see that their loved ones are being prosecuted or going to jail, or even want to send them out of the home. So we're left with family scenarios that are going to be potentially volatile. So looking for systemic changes in the home might be a very good way to go when we're thinking about the potential for behavioral health to really help with this problem.
Good. We have like 2 minutes left, and we have to wrap up and go back into the large group for 15 minutes before we all call it a day. So we could probably take 1 or 2 more comments relative to any of this.
Hi, Katie Glenis. I just wanted to add that, in my experience, the most powerful way to reach an older adult is by support groups. I run 3 different support groups. They're once a week, they're an hour and a half, and that is where I see the most empowerment, the safest place for people to talk about these other issues around polyvictimization, and that they realize that they're not alone, and that they are not the only ones living like that. And it helps build up their self-esteem, their confidence, and they learn what their options are. So, and they're the first to say that they've never been in a situation where they felt so safe being with other people to talk about these things that they've never talked about before.
I think the piece that we're missing today is the perpetrator. I think that a lot of victims are living with perpetrators and identify with the struggles that perpetrators encounter. And I think that we would be remiss to think that those victims aren't thinking about what's going to happen to the perpetrator and if the perpetrator is going to be in a safe environment. A lot of times we have mental health issues and chemical dependency issues in perpetrators. And so for victims to be reassured that that perpetrator is going to get the help that they need is going to be an important piece for victim planning in the future.
Yes, and statistically, of course, it doesn't matter what state you look at, statistically, the vast majority of elder abuse victims who are being harmed by a family member or other loved and needed one, statistically, the vast majority are not going to terminate the relationship once the abuse is discovered. They love that son, that husband, that daughter, that long-term best friend or niece. They're not going to terminate the relationship. They don't want to. They want that person to be nicer. So it does become very challenging, and to think about what interventions can be applied that would help the older person to be safer. And also a resource question with funding, because if we're struggling to get mental health services for the victim, where's the money for the mental health services for the perpetrator? But we realize they're needed, and it all goes back to funding to some degree. We need to wrap up. We need to go back to the larger group. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your input and just for being here because, you know, we need the rich dialogue and the input. You're going to have opportunity to give written input and leave it with us before you go home, and please do that, okay? So we're going to go back to the big session for a few minutes. Thank you.